Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can discuss the topic of moderate MGTOW. Another question here would be, is a moderate stance like this possible, logical, and does it make men happier? So what is MGTOW? And I've done a few videos on this topic, and I've seen comments and emails that talk about a number of different ideologies or attitudes within the community. But at its most extreme version, here's what we see with the MGTOW ideology. It's essentially where a man has no romantic contact with a woman. No marriage, no intimacy, no long-term relationship of any type, no financial entanglement, and obviously no children. With the extremes, you also see men who want to live off the grid, not pay taxes, live in the woods, things like that. That's more rare. I don't see that as often, but at the very extremes we do see that philosophy as well. We also see a lot of anger and vitriol and an enthusiasm to expand this belief system to a larger population. So to warn men about the dangers of relationships with women. Some of the members of this community believe that their behavior is an appropriate reaction to feminism. They believe that feminism is toxic and that the MGTOW ideology counters feminism. Some believe that this ideology will make women behave differently, so it'll lead to some sort of societal level change. They tend to think of men who marry women and have other long-term relationships with women and who have children as unenlightened, uneducated, in for a surprise when their marriage ends in divorce, and essentially they paint men like this as losers. And of course, not surprisingly, based on some of their beliefs, they have an extremely negative view of women. Again, when we're looking at this extreme version of MGTOW. So with this type of MGTOW, you essentially have a man who believes the behavior of women is problematic in society, and so is the behavior of men who are with women. So the first part of this philosophy, the no marriage, the no long-term relationships, this part is becoming more common. I've seen in my clinical experience more men who are adopting this philosophy. I'll refer to this as the moderate MGTOW stance. As for the rest of these parts, they're not as common, like breaking away from society and causing widespread political and societal level change. These types of stances are out there, to be sure, but not nearly as common as, again, the moderate MGTOW stance. So this moderate MGTOW stance is essentially an ideology, a set of ideas and ideals, a set of strategies that are employed repeatedly. We see men who feel like the system is against them. We see this belief that there are trends in politics, the attitudes of women, and trends in relationships that are going against them. For example, unfavorable outcomes in long-term relationships, like being taken advantage of, infidelity, divorce, unfair treatment when getting divorced, like unfair property division. We see alimony, child support, unfair treatment by law enforcement when there's an accusation of intimate partner violence or other crimes. So this ideology says that false accusations are common and they tend to be believed. The accusers tend to be believed, even if there's not evidence to support it. So again, with this moderate stance, these individuals typically aren't active in advocating that other people behave in the same way that they behave. They're not trying to convince people of their ideology. Rather, they view themselves as simply making a decision to protect themselves, to avoid romantic relationships with women, especially long-term relationships. From my clinical experience, I've often seen this as a fairly quiet decision. Men adopting this particular stance typically do not seek attention. They've quietly made this decision to live a life without romance. So a number of questions can arise from this idea of moderate MGTOW. Is this strategy logical? Are men really better off with this strategy? Do they accumulate more wealth? Are they happier with this strategy than men that don't use it? Do the benefits of this ideology outweigh the costs? Do women fare better in divorce than men? This is kind of a foundational piece to this ideology. Are men who adopt this ideology reacting to a few bad experiences, or are these experiences common to all men or to most men? And can this strategy be maintained over a long period of time? So many men can adopt this position and it might last for several months or even a few years. But what about the long term? Well, we don't have a lot of research on MGTOW, but we do have research around topics that seem important to this ideology, like divorce. And I'm also going to base a lot of this on my clinical experience, working with men who have adopted this moderate stance. So I'll do my best to answer these questions. Of course, this is just really my opinion for the most part. So starting out here with the first question, is this strategy logical? Are men really better off with it? I would say for some men, they probably are better off with this strategy. If someone really values their freedom, independence, wealth, alone time, if someone doesn't want to have responsibilities, then I suppose avoiding long-term relationships would help to meet those specific goals. For the majority of men, though, I simply don't see enough evidence that supports that this is a reasonable strategy. I think there's this idea among those with the moderate stance and the other stances of MGTOW that most men are oblivious to this life of peace that they could live if they would just choose to avoid romantic relationships. But the reality is that most men realize that this is a possibility. Most men realize that they could stop being in romantic relationships. Yet they still choose to be in these types of relationships. Now, I can appreciate how many men don't realize how bad things could turn out. Like in family court, they don't realize how devastating divorces are both financially and emotionally. Certainly both men and women would benefit from more knowledge about how relationships can turn out when they go bad. I don't think this is unique to men. So how about the question of accumulating more wealth? Does this strategy lead to more wealth accumulation? Well, I would think that all things being equal, a man or a woman who works and lives alone can probably accumulate more wealth than they would if they were married and had children, simply because of the high cost of raising children and, of course, the risk of divorce. How about this question around women faring better in divorce than men? So there's this idea in the MGTOW philosophy that when a divorce occurs, women do okay and men disproportionately suffer. Well, to answer this question, we have to look at some of the research on subjective measures of well-being on this topic. And what we see here from the research literature is that men are more vulnerable to short-term consequences of divorce. So they tend not to do as well immediately after a divorce, within the first 6 months or so. Outside of the short term, women and men are similar in terms of economic well-being, mental and physical health, chances of finding another partner, social integration, and feelings of loneliness. One area where there is a large difference between the genders over the long run would be that women have greater losses in household income and a greater increase in the risk of poverty as a result of divorce. So overall, these findings suggest that men's disproportionate strain of divorce is transient, whereas for women, it's chronic. So this really doesn't support a lot of what we see in this MGTOW ideology. The science doesn't support it. Moving on to the next question, this is the one related to are men just reacting to a few bad experiences. Well, the likelihood that any marriage will end in divorce is about 50%. Second marriages fail 65% of the time, and third marriages fail 70% of the time. And most people would agree that divorces are devastating in many ways. So I can appreciate how someone can evaluate the avoiding of relationships as positive. There's a good statistical argument that can be made here, for both men and women, that marriages and long-term relationships often end in a way that neither party intended nor wanted. Even though 50% of marriages do not end in divorce, 70 to 80% of people who stay in marriages are unhappy. Grim statistics, to be sure. A number of marriages end because of disagreements about money and physical intimacy. Some of these problems can be avoided if the couple had sought counseling before marriage and let strong emotions settle down before getting married. Personality factors actually explain a lot of somebody's financial and romantic behavior, so a counselor could help with a situation like this. But of course, the majority of people do not seek counseling before they get married. And even when people do, that doesn't necessarily mean their marriage is divorce-proof, nothing like that. Counseling can help somewhat, certainly, but it's no guarantee that people are going to stay together. So moving on to the next question. Can the strategy work in the long run? So again, I've talked about how men can adopt this philosophy, this ideology, and apply it for several months, maybe even several years. But is it really sustainable? Well, of course there will always be exceptions. There'll be people that can make this work. But generally speaking, I have not seen this as a successful strategy for most men. There's a lot of emotional, cognitive, philosophical, societal, theological, and biological reasons that people want long-term partners. It's not something that men can just simply turn off. I have seen a number of men unhappy in marriage. I've also seen just as many women unhappy in marriage. Marriage is a sacrifice. Other long-term relationships are too. The idea that marriage will bring a man or a woman happiness, as I mentioned before, just isn't really statistically a realistic assumption. We know that in terms of happiness, people who stay married or remain single tend to be the most happy, right? So people who are divorced tend to be the least happy. Not many people want to enter into a relationship with the philosophy that they're going to have to sacrifice for another person. It's a really unpopular concept. Go into a relationship to give more than you receive? That doesn't seem fair. And fairness, of course, is a major theme that we see in this moderate MGTOW stance, and in a lot of stances that involve not wanting to be in long-term relationships. When both people in a marriage or in a long-term relationship have the mentality of giving more than they receive, well, that's really how successful marriages are formed. So some final thoughts here on the moderate MGTOW stance. I can appreciate where some of these ideas come from. I think the challenge here is thinking that all women are the same, and thinking that all men who have relationships with women are the same. That simply doesn't account for individual differences. Also, divorce often cannot be blamed on just one member of the couple. Sometimes, certainly, but not all the time. Usually both people contribute in some way to the failure of a marriage. Now, some of the statistics around relationships are not encouraging, but adopting an ideology that rejects the potential of a positive long-term relationship comes with its own set of challenges, at least for many men, like loneliness, depression, and feeling unfulfilled. Other than adopting the MGTOW stance, another possibility would be exercising a lot of caution in the dating process, making sure you find someone who's a good match for you, and maintaining a high level of communication with your partner. We see some evidence that if a marriage can last for 10 years, the risk of divorce drops by quite a bit. So we see that there's a period of vulnerability here, the early parts of the relationship. Everything that people do comes with risk. Long-term relationships, avoiding long-term relationships, whatever it is, everything carries risk. I think what's key here is about understanding the risks and doing what's reasonable to minimize them. Regardless of the decision that somebody makes to adopt or not to adopt an ideology, I think that counseling makes sense. And it's certainly worth the investment considering the high cost of a failed relationship, even if the counseling only reduces that risk by a small amount. So I know whenever I talk about topics like this, like MGTOW and relationships, there will be a variety of opinions, people who agree with me and disagree with me. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They're sure to generate a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of the moderate MGTOW stance to be interesting. Thanks for watching.